The first time I noticed the silence in our house, it wasn't because it was quiet. It was because the silence felt heavy, like the air right before a massive summer thunderstorm. You know that feeling when the humidity clings to your skin, and you just know the sky is about to split open? That was my life with Mark. Or at least, that was the life I thought I was living. We had been married for 3 years, and if you had asked me on our anniversary, I would have told you we were the gold standard. I'm a freelance graphic designer, a job that involves staring at pixels until they make sense, and Mark is a civil engineer, the kind of man who measures everything twice and only cuts when he's absolutely certain. We were a match made in logical heaven. I handled the aesthetics. He handled the structural integrity. Our finances followed that same logic. We had a joint account for the mortgage and the boring stuff like utilities and groceries, but we kept our personal fun accounts separate. It was a system built on a foundation of mutual respect. Or so I told myself every morning while I sipped my artisanal coffee. I remember the smell of that coffee so clearly now. It was a medium roast with notes of hazelnut and chocolate, the kind of small luxury I allowed myself because I worked 14-hour days to afford it. I remember sitting at my mahogany desk, the sun catching the dust motes dancing in the air, feeling completely and utterly in control of my world. Then came the Sunday brunch at Lydia's. Lydia, my mother-in-law, is a woman who doesn't just enter a room. She inspects it. She's a retired senior auditor for one of the big banks. And even in retirement, she carries herself with the rigid posture of someone who expects to find a missing decimal point in every conversation. That Sunday, her house smelled like lavender polish and expensive disappointment. I remember the way the silver spoons clinked against the porcelain teacups, a sharp, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. Lydia sat across from me, her silk blouse buttoned all the way to her chin, her eyes tracking the movement of my hands. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my wrists, my rings, the way I held my fork. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her Earl Grey and leaned in, her voice like velvet wrapped around a razor blade. "Elena, dear," she said, "I couldn't help but notice that your new handbag is a very specific shade of charcoal. Is that the limited edition from the autumn collection? It must have been quite the investment for a freelancer." I felt a small prickle of heat at the back of my neck. I hadn't told her about the bag. In fact, I hadn't even shown it to Mark yet. It was still tucked away in its dust bag in my closet. I forced a smile and replied, "Oh, you have a keen eye, Lydia." It was a gift to myself for landing the rebranding contract with the tech firm I mentioned. She didn't smile back. She just nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window. "A contract," she mused. "Contracts are so ephemeral, aren't they? One day they're there, and the next the budget is cut. It's a precarious way to live. Mark, honey, pass me the sugar. You know, I can't stand things when they're too bitter." Mark laughed, that easy, carefree sound that I used to find charming. "Mom, Elena is the most organized person I know. She has spreadsheets for her spreadsheets. Don't worry about us." He reached over and squeezed my hand, but his palm felt clammy. I looked at him, searching for a sign of discomfort, but he was already busy piling more smoked salmon onto his plate. The drive home was quiet. The hum of the tires against the asphalt usually soothed me, but that day it felt like a low growl. I kept thinking about her comment. How did she know the specific color of a bag I hadn't even worn yet? Maybe I'd left a tab open on my laptop? No, I was meticulous about closing my workspace. Maybe Mark mentioned it. I glanced at him. He was humming along to a jazz station, his fingers tapping the steering wheel in perfect time. "Hey, Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Did you tell your mom about the new bag I bought? The charcoal one?" He didn't skip a beat. "The bag? No, I don't think so." "Why?" "She probably just saw an ad for it. You know how those algorithms work." They follow you everywhere. Right, I whispered, looking out the side window at the blurred trees. The algorithms. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed me into the house. It followed me into my office. I walked over to the antique filing cabinet where I kept my physical records, my just-in-case paper trail. I'm old school like that. I like the weight of paper. I noticed the third drawer, the one labeled personal/tax, was open by a fraction of an inch. I always lock that drawer. Always. I reached out and touched the handle. It was cold. I pulled it open and saw my bank statement folder. It looked fine, but as I reached in to pull out the latest statement, I saw it. On the corner of a white envelope, right where you'd grip it to pull it out of the stack, was a tiny, faint smudge. It was a muted, dusty pink color. T-rose. It was the exact shade of lipstick Lydia had been wearing for 30 years. My heart didn't just race. It felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I stared at that smudge for what felt like hours. It wasn't just a mark on paper. It was a footprint in my private sanctum. I sat down in my swivel chair, the leather creaking under me. I started thinking back to all the little comments Lydia had made over the last few months. The time she asked if I really needed all those streaming services. The time she mentioned that my favorite organic grocery store was having a disgraceful markup on kale. I had always brushed it off as her being a nosy, frugal woman who spent too much time on Facebook. But this was different. This was physical. I looked at my phone. It sat there on the desk, a black mirror reflecting the overhead light. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to check everything. I opened my banking app, my fingers trembling so much I mistyped my passcode twice. I went to the security settings, deep into the menus where they hide the login history. I scrolled past my own phone, past my desktop, and then I saw it. An IP address I didn't recognize. A login from a MacBook Pro at 10:15 a.m. last Tuesday. I was at the gym last Tuesday. Mark was at work. I copied the IP address and ran a quick trace. My breath hitched. It wasn't a home address. It was a public Wi-Fi signal. Specifically, the Wi-Fi at the Gilded Bean, a boutique coffee shop 3 blocks away from Lydia's gated community. It's the place where she meets her bridge club every Tuesday morning. I leaned back, the room suddenly feeling too small, the walls closing in. I could hear Mark in the living room, the muffled sound of a sports commentator and the occasional clink of a beer bottle against the coffee table. He seemed so normal, so oblivious. Or was he? I began to replay our conversations in my head, looking for the gaps, the silences where the truth might be hiding. I remembered a text message from him 2 weeks ago. I pulled it up. "Hey babe, Mom's coming over to drop off some of that lasagna you like. I'll give her the spare key, so she can just leave it in the fridge while we're out. Love you." I had replied, "Sure, sounds good. Tell her thanks." I felt a wave of nausea. The lasagna, the spare key, the lipstick on the envelope. It wasn't an algorithm following me. It was a woman who had spent 40 years auditing the lives of strangers, and now she had turned her clinical, calculating gaze on me. But why? We weren't in debt. We weren't asking her for money. We were successful. I stood up and walked to the door of my office, looking out at Mark. He was sprawled on the sofa, the blue light of the TV dancing across his face. He looked like the man I loved. But as I watched him, I realized I didn't know if he was the man who protected me or the man who opened the door for the person who wanted to tear my life apart. I thought about confronting him right then, but a voice in my head, a voice that sounded a lot like my own professional intuition, told me to wait. If this was an audit, I needed to see the full ledger. I needed to know exactly how deep the red ink went before I made my move. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and quietly locked the drawer. I didn't say a word. I just sat there in the dark, watching the tea rose smudge on the envelope until the sun went down and the shadows swallowed the room whole. This was just the beginning. I could feel it. The facade of the perfect marriage was still standing, but the foundation? The foundation was already starting to crumble. I stayed in that chair until my legs felt numb, my mind spinning through every possible explanation that didn't involve a total betrayal of trust. Maybe she was just worried. Maybe she thought I was hiding something from Mark. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Lydia didn't do worried. She did control. To her, money wasn't just currency, it was a scorecard. And apparently, she had decided that my score was something she needed to verify. I heard Mark call out from the living room. "Elle, you okay in there? You've been quiet for a long time. Do you want me to order some Thai food?" I took a deep breath, smoothing my hair and forcing my voice to sound steady. "Yeah, Mark. Thai sounds great. Get the spicy basil noodles. I'm just finishing up a design. I'll be out in a minute." "You got it," he shouted back, his voice full of that same easy, terrifying warmth. I looked at the smudge one last time. I realized then that I wasn't just a wife or a daughter-in-law anymore. I was a subject. I was being scrutinized under a microscope I didn't even know was there. And as I walked out to join my husband for dinner, I felt a cold, hard knot tie itself in my stomach. I was going to play along. I was going to be the perfect, unsuspecting wife. But I was also going to start my own audit. And God helped them both when I found the balance. The spicy basil noodles tasted like ash in my mouth that night. Every time Mark laughed at a joke on the television, I found myself studying the way the light hit his eyes, looking for a flicker of guilt, a shadow of the man who might be handing over my private life to his mother. I kept my phone face down on the coffee table, a silent brick of glass and metal that felt like a ticking bomb. I realized that if I was going to find out the truth, I couldn't just be a designer anymore. I had to be a ghost. The next morning, I waited for the sound of the garage door rumbling shut, signaling Mark's departure for the construction site. I stood by the window, hidden behind the heavy linen curtains, watching his silver truck disappear around the corner. The house was suddenly cavernous, the silence no longer peaceful, but predatory. I went straight to my office and sat at my desk, but I didn't open my design software. Instead, I pulled up the browser's incognito mode and began the digital excavation. I started with our shared Amazon account. We used it for everything: toilet paper, light bulbs, the mundane clutter of a shared life. I scrolled through the order history, looking for anything out of place. There it was, 3 weeks ago, a high-end, motion-activated nanny cam disguised as a USB wall charger. It hadn't been delivered to our house. The shipping address was Lydia's. The payment method, our joint credit card. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thud. Mark must have seen that charge. He must have authorized it. Or worse, he bought it for her. I felt a sudden, frantic need to talk to someone who wasn't part of the circle of lies. I thought of Sophie, Mark's younger sister. Sophie was 24, a struggling actress who lived in a tiny studio apartment that Lydia paid for. She was the family's free spirit, which was really just Lydia's code for someone I can easily manipulate with a checkbook. Sophie and I had always been friendly, bonded by our shared status as outsiders in the cold, auditing world of the Miller family. I called her. She picked up on the fourth ring, her voice sounding groggy and thick with sleep. "Elena, is everything okay? It's barely 10. "I need to see you, Sophie," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Can I come over? I'll bring those expensive croissants you love from the bakery on 4th. "Croissants? You're speaking my language. Come on over. The place is a mess, but the door is open." 30 minutes later, I was sitting on Sophie's sagging velvet sofa, the smell of stale incense and buttery pastry filling the small room. Sophie was tearing into a croissant, but she was watching me with an intensity that told me she knew this wasn't a social call. "Okay, Elle," she said, wiping a flake of pastry from her lip. "Spit it out. You look like you're about to vomit or commit a crime. Which one is it?" I leaned forward, dropping my voice. "Sophie, be honest with me. Has your mother said anything to you about my spending? Or about my work? I found something. I found out she's been looking at my bank statements." Sophie froze. The croissant stayed halfway to her mouth. She looked away, her eyes darting toward the window, where a single pigeon sat on the fire escape. "Oh, God," she whispered. "She did it. I told her it was a bad idea. I told her you'd find out." My blood went cold. "She told you?" "Sophie, what exactly did she say?" Sophie sighed, a long, shaky sound. She stood up and walked to a cluttered bookshelf, pulling out a thick, black, leather-bound notebook. She handed it to me. "She left this here last weekend when she came over to check on my chores. She forgot it. I haven't had the guts to give it back because I saw what was inside." I opened the notebook. My hands were shaking so violently the pages rattled. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a ledger. On the first page, in Lydia's perfect, slanted cursive, were the words, "Elena's financial feasibility audit." I turned the pages. It was a nightmare of precision. She had columns for everything. Dining out, luxury goods, professional expenses unverified, personal maintenance. There were dates, amounts, and even little handwritten notes in the margins. Next to a charge for a hair salon, she had written, "Excessive. Mark's grandmother used a bar of soap for 80 years. Next to my subscription for Adobe Creative Cloud, she'd noted, "Check if Mark is subsidizing this hobby." She calls it the daughter-in-law ledger. Sophie said, her voice small and filled with shame. "She thinks she's saving Mark, Elena. She thinks you're a lifestyle vampire." Those were her words. She told me she was worried you were going to drain his future inheritance and leave him with nothing but a pile of designer shoes and worthless art. I looked at the ledger, my vision blurring. "And Mark? Does he know about this?" Sophie looked at her feet. "He knows she's concerned. He helps her sometimes because he can't say no to her. She's his mother, Elle. She's been the one holding the purse strings for the whole family since Dad died. Mark thinks if he just gives her a little bit of info, she'll satisfy her curiosity and stop. He thinks he's managing her. He doesn't realize she's documenting you like a criminal." I closed the book with a heavy thud. "He's helping her. He's my husband, Sophie. He's supposed to be on my team." "I know," Sophie said, reaching out to touch my arm. "I'm sorry. I really am. But you know, Mom, she doesn't see people. She sees assets and liabilities. And right now, Elena, she's moved you firmly into the liability column." I left Sophie's apartment feeling like the world had shifted 10 degrees off its axis. Every person I passed on the street felt like a potential spy. I drove to a hardware store 3 towns over, somewhere I knew I wouldn't be recognized. I bought a small, high-definition internal security camera. If they were going to play at being auditors, I was going to be the internal investigator. I spent the afternoon setting it up. I didn't put it in the kitchen or the living room. I put it in my office, hidden inside an old, hollowed-out book on the top shelf, angled perfectly toward my filing cabinet and my desk. I synced it to an encrypted cloud account that wasn't linked to any of our shared emails. That evening, I was a masterpiece of suburban normalcy. I made a roast chicken. I asked Mark about the bridge project. I even laughed when he told a story about a clumsy intern. But inside, I was screaming. I felt like I was wearing a mask that was slowly suffocating me. "You seem different tonight," Mark said as we were cleaning up the kitchen. He was drying a plate, his brow furrowed. A good different, just very focused. I smiled at him, a hollow, practiced movement of my lips. "Just a big project at work. Honey, You know how I get when I'm in the zone. I do, he said, leaning in to kiss my forehead. I love that about you. Your drive. Just don't work too hard. Okay? Mom was asking if we wanted to go to the lake house this weekend. She says she wants to talk to us about long-term planning. The words long-term planning felt like a threat. We'll see, I said. Let's see how the week goes. I went to bed early, pretending to be exhausted. I waited until I heard Mark's breathing turn heavy and rhythmic next to me. I pulled out my phone, shielding the light with my hand, and opened the app for the hidden camera. The feed was grainy but clear enough. The office was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside the window. For an hour, nothing happened. I was almost ready to fall asleep, to believe that maybe Sophie was wrong, that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Then, the door to the office creaked open. I held my breath, the phone screen vibrating in my hand. A figure entered. It was Mark. He didn't turn on the light. He used the flashlight on his phone, the beam cutting through the darkness like a searchlight. He walked straight to my filing cabinet. He pulled a key out of his pocket, a copy I didn't know he had, and unlocked the drawer. I watched, my heart breaking in real time, as my husband began to take photos of my bank statements with his phone. He was methodical. He'd flip a page, click a photo, flip a page, click a photo. He was so careful not to leave a trace. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and whispered to the empty room, "I'm doing it, Mom. Just hold on." He finished the stack, locked the drawer, and slipped out of the room as quietly as a thief. I stared at the black screen of my phone long after the feed went dark. The betrayal wasn't a sharp pain. It was a cold, creeping numbness that started in my toes and worked its way up to my throat. Mark wasn't just managing his mother. He was her field agent. He was the one breaking into the vault so she could count the gold. I looked at Mark's back, rising and falling in the darkness. He looked so innocent in his sleep. I thought about the man I had married, the man who promised to cherish me, to protect our life together. That man was a ghost. The man in this bed was a stranger, an accomplice in a psychological war I didn't even know was being waged. I realized then that Lydia's motives weren't just about money. This was about ownership. She didn't just want to know what I spent. She wanted to prove that I didn't belong in this family. She wanted to show Mark that I was a flaw in his perfect, calculated life. And the most terrifying part was that he was letting her. He was handing her the hammer to shatter our life together. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just lay there, watching the digital clock on the bedside table flip from 2:59 to 3 a.m. I had the evidence. I had the camera. I had Sophie's confession. But as I stared into the dark, I knew I needed more. I needed to know why Lydia was so obsessed with my spending. An auditor doesn't dig this deep unless they're looking for something specific, or unless they're trying to hide a deficit of their own. I began to think about Lydia's career. The senior auditor who retired early, the woman who lived in a gated community but never seemed to have a hobby other than criticizing others. There was a hole in her story, a missing decimal point in her own history. And if I was going to survive this, I had to find it. I waited for the sun to rise, the gray light of dawn slowly revealing the familiar furniture of our bedroom. It all looked the same, but it was all different. Every object in this room was now a witness. I reached out and touched Mark's shoulder, a light, mocking gesture. "Sleep well, Mark," I whispered, so quietly even the silence couldn't hear me. "Enjoy the audit while it lasts, because I'm about to start one of my own." I got out of bed, the floorboards cold under my feet, and walked back to my office. I had work to do, not design work, not the ephemeral contracts Lydia despised. I was going to do some real auditing. I was going to dig into the past of Lydia Miller until I found the rot beneath the porcelain and the lavender. And when I found it, I wasn't going to just show Mark. I was going to show the whole world. The chapter of being the victim was over. The investigation had moved from my bank account to hers. And as I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light, I felt a strange, cold sense of peace. The game was on, and I had no intention of losing. The dread didn't come all at once. It arrived in increments, like a rising tide of ice water. By Tuesday afternoon, the air in our house felt chemically altered, heavy with the scent of Mark's expensive sandalwood cologne and the metallic tang of my own fear. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at a bowl of wax-like apples, when my phone buzzed on the granite. A text from Lydia. She'd started bypassing the pleasantries entirely. The message read, "Elena, I was looking at the family's quarterly projections. It seems there's a recurring charge of $84 for something called ArtStream Pro. Is this a business necessity, or are we subsidizing your entertainment again? Mark mentioned you were tightening your belt this month. Perhaps we should discuss your definition of a tight belt." I felt a surge of heat crawl up my throat. "We." She said we. I typed back, my thumbs stiff. "Lydia, that's a software suite for my client work. It's a business expense. And I'm not sure why you're looking at family projections that involve my personal software subscriptions." The 3 dots of her typing appeared instantly. They danced there for a long time, mocking me. Then, "I'm only trying to help you see the patterns, dear. When you're in the fog of spending, you miss the lighthouse. Mark tells me you've been very stressed lately. Maybe your business is becoming too much for you to manage?" I didn't reply. I couldn't. I looked up to see Mark standing in the doorway, his work boots still on, leaving faint traces of red clay on the hardwood. He was looking at me with a pained, pitying expression that made me want to scream. He walked over, his footsteps heavy, and placed a hand on my shoulder. I flinched, and his face clouded over. Honey, why are you being so combative with her?" Mark asked, his voice low and soothing, the way you'd talk to a frightened animal. "She just sent me a screenshot of your reply. You're being really defensive about a simple question." I turned the stool to face him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "A simple question, Mark. She's tracking my software subscriptions. She's calling my career a hobby and suggesting I can't manage my own life. How does she even have that information? Did you give her my login?" Mark sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted, but it was the exhaustion of a man who thought he was dealing with a hysteric, not a victim. "I didn't give her a login. We were just talking about the budget, and I might have mentioned I saw the charge on the joint card statement. She's an auditor, L. She sees a number, and she wants to know what it represents. She's just trying to make sure we're set up for the mortgage renewal. Why are you making this a federal case?" "Because it's my life, Mark. It's my privacy." I stood up, the chair legs screeching against the floor. "You were in my office at 3 in the morning taking photos of my private statements. I saw you on the camera." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. Mark didn't blink. He didn't even look surprised. He just lowered his hand and stared at me with a terrifyingly calm gaze. "You put a camera in our home, Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You spied on me in our own house. Do you see how paranoid you're becoming? Mom told me you might start acting out if we pressured you to be more transparent, but I didn't think you'd go this far." "Acting out," I whispered. "I'm acting out because I want to keep my own bank records private." "Mark, listen to yourself. You're quoting her. You're using her words." "I'm using common sense," he snapped, his composure finally breaking. "You're making thousands of dollars a month, and we have nothing to show for it in the joint savings because you're blowing it on supplies and subscriptions and God knows what else. Mom is just trying to help us find the leak. If you weren't hiding something, you wouldn't have hidden a camera to catch me spying on a bank statement I have every right to see as your husband. You don't have a right to my separate business account, Mark. That was the deal. The deal changed when we became a family, he said, walking toward the fridge and grabbing a water bottle, his back to me. Or at least it should have. You're so obsessed with mine and yours that you've forgotten there's an ours. Mom is worried you're planning an exit strategy. Are you, Elena? Is that why you're so protective of every cent? I felt like I was drowning in a sea of his logic. It was gaslighting at its most refined. He had taken his betrayal, his literal breaking and entering into my files, and turned it into a symptom of my mental instability. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This wasn't just a mother-in-law problem anymore. This was a husband who had been completely assimilated. That night, the house felt like a battlefield. We didn't speak. We lay on opposite sides of the bed. The space between us a vast, frozen wasteland. Every time my phone chimed, my stomach did a somersault. It was a barrage of check-ins from Lydia, each one more condescending than the last. At 11:30 p.m., Elena, I noticed a charge for the green room last Friday. $62 for lunch. Mark said he had leftovers that day. I hope you're not making a habit of these solo indulgences while he works in the sun. It's a matter of character, really. At 11:45 p.m., I've prepared a spreadsheet for you to fill out by Sunday. It breaks down your last 3 months of professional costs. I'd like to see receipts for anything over $50. It's for your own good, dear. You'll thank me when you see where the money is actually going. I stared at the ceiling, the light of the phone burning my eyes. I felt a desperate, clawing need to fight back, but I knew that, if I exploded, I would only prove them right. I would be that unstable one. I had to be smarter. I had to be the auditor. I waited until I was sure Mark was asleep. I crept out of bed, my feet silent on the carpet, and went into the guest room. I locked the door and pulled out my laptop. I didn't go to my bank. I went to the public records of the city, where Lydia had worked for 25 years. I started with the news archives. Lydia Miller, senior auditor, promoted to regional head. Lydia Miller chairs charity gala. It was all gold stars and accolades. But then, the trail went cold about 10 years ago. No retirement party announcement. No long-time employee moves on fluff piece. Just a sudden, sharp stop. I dug deeper into the legal filings of the bank she'd worked for. I searched for internal restructuring and discrepancies during the years she left. I found a redacted PDF of an internal memo that mentioned a voluntary resignation of a senior officer following an inquiry into the mismanagement of trust accounts. My breath caught. Mismanagement. I felt a sudden jolt of adrenaline. I wasn't just looking at a nosy woman. I was looking at a woman who might have been a predator. I searched for any civil suits from that era. Nothing under her name. She had been protected. The bank had buried it to avoid a scandal. But banks don't just let people walk away from mismanagement unless there's a deal. As I sat there, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in the window, I heard a soft thud outside the guest room door. My heart stopped. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keys. Elena! Mark's voice was muffled by the wood. What are you doing in there? Why is the door locked? I took a slow, steadying breath. I couldn't sleep, Mark. I'm just doing some research for a project. I didn't want the light to wake you up. Research, he repeated. The word sounded like a slur. Is that what we're calling it now? Mom was right. You're staying up late, locking doors, hiding things. You're spiraling. Elle, open the door. I'll be out in a minute. Mark, just let me finish this. Open the door now, or I'm calling her. he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She's worried you're having some kind of breakdown. And honestly, I'm starting to agree. You're acting like a criminal. I stood up, my legs shaking. I realized that the text battles and the audits were just the outer layers. The core of this was a total takeover of my reality. They were building a case against my sanity so they could take control of my life and my money. I walked to the door and turned the lock. Mark was standing there, his phone in his hand, the screen glowing with an open message thread to his mother. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and pity that made my skin crawl. "Show me the laptop," he said. "No," I replied, my voice surprisingly firm. "It's my work laptop, Mark. You have no right." "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be," he whispered. He stepped closer, his shadow looming over me. "We just want to help you. Why can't you see that? We love you. We're trying to save you from yourself." I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see the man I married. I saw a puppet. I saw a man who had been told so many lies that he couldn't recognize the truth if it bit him. "If you love me," I said, "then leave me alone. Let me sleep." He stared at me for a long beat, then turned and walked back toward our bedroom. "The spreadsheet is due Sunday, Elena. Don't be late. Mom doesn't like to be kept waiting." I shut the door and leaned against it, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. The tension in the house was now a physical weight, a pressure in my ears that wouldn't go away. I went back to the laptop, my hands flying across the keys. I didn't look for bank statements anymore. I looked for the name of the man who had been the CEO of that bank 10 years ago. I looked for the people Lydia had audited out of their jobs. I was no longer just defending my spending. I was hunting a ghost. And as the sun began to peek through the blinds, I found it. A small, obscure blog post from a former bank employee who claimed they were fired to cover up a senior auditor's habit of borrowing from dormant accounts. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. Lydia Miller wanted to talk about character. She wanted to talk about solo indulgences. Fine, we would talk about it. But we wouldn't be talking about $62 lunches. We would be talking about the missing millions. I grabbed my phone and saw a final text from Lydia, sent at 4 a.m. "I hope you're reflecting on your choices, Elena. Silence is often the sound of a guilty conscience." "You have no idea, Lydia," I whispered to the empty room. "The silence is over, and the audit is just getting started." The smell of old paper and ozone from my laser printer filled the guest room as I began to assemble what I called the mirror ledger. It was 4 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, and the house was a tomb. I had spent the last 6 hours tumbling down a rabbit hole of corporate filings and archived digital footprints that Lydia Miller thought she'd erased with the same precision she used to polish her silver. My eyes ached, the screen's blue light making the veins in my temples throb, but the adrenaline was a cold, sharp blade keeping me upright. I had found it. The voluntary resignation wasn't voluntary, and it wasn't just about mismanagement. I found an archived civil complaint from 2016, buried in a county database, filed by a woman named Martha Vance. Martha was 92 years old and lived in a high-end assisted living facility, the kind where the bills are paid automatically from a trust. The complaint alleged that over a period of 4 years, nearly $200,000 had been bled from Martha's secondary holdings. The auditor in charge of monitoring those accounts, Lydia Miller, the suit had been settled out of court. No admission of guilt, no criminal charges, just a quiet disappearance from the banking world and a sudden, lavish retirement into a gated community. Lydia hadn't just audited people, she had harvested them. I sat back, the plastic of the chair creaking in the silence. My hands were stone cold. I realized then that Lydia's obsession with my spending wasn't just about control, it was about projection. She was terrified of a woman who managed her own money because she knew exactly how easy it was to manipulate someone who didn't. But then a new thought crawled into my mind, darker and more invasive than the rest. If Lydia was a predator, and she was helping Mark with our finances, what was she doing to him? I pulled up our joint savings account. On the surface, it looked normal. Monthly contributions from my business account, monthly contributions from Mark's salary. The balance grew at a steady, unremarkable rate. But as a designer, I'm trained to notice when things are a pixel off. I exported the last 2 years of data into a CSV file and ran a custom script to flag any recurring transfers that didn't match our typical bills. There. Every second Tuesday of the month, the same day Lydia went to the Gilded Bean for her bridge club, a transfer of exactly $450 left the joint account. It was labeled Mort INS, which I had always assumed was a mortgage insurance premium. I looked at our mortgage contract, which I kept in a digital vault. We didn't have a separate mortgage insurance premium. It was bundled into our escrow. I felt a sudden, violent urge to be sick. I wasn't just being watched, we were being robbed. I followed the trail of the Mort INS transfers. They didn't go to a bank or an insurance company. They went to a private brokerage account. I used the account number and a bit of social engineering, calling the brokerage's automated line, and using Mark's social security number, which I knew by heart, to check the balance. The automated voice was calm, female, and utterly devastating. The current balance for the account ending in 4921 is $87,412. $87,000. That was nearly all of our missing savings. But the voice wasn't finished. The primary account holder is Lydia Miller. The secondary beneficiary is Mark Miller. My breath left me in a ragged gasp. Mark didn't even have primary access to his own stolen money. Lydia had convinced him to set up these insurance payments, or perhaps she had set them up herself using the spare key to our digital life he'd so willingly handed her. She was building a nest egg for him, with our money that she controlled entirely. She was ensuring that if he ever left me, or if she ever decided I was bankrupt, he would have a fortune that only she could unlock. I heard the floorboards outside the guest room groan. I didn't close the laptop. I didn't hide the papers. The time for hiding was over. The door handle turned, and Mark stepped in, squinting against the light. He was wearing his gray sweatpants, his hair rumpled from sleep. He looked so vulnerable, so fundamentally ordinary. "Elena, it's 5 a.m., he said, his voice thick with sleep. "What are you doing?" I saw the light under the door. "Are you still obsessing over the audit?" I looked at him, and I felt a wave of profound grief. "Mark, sit down. We need to talk about the insurance." He blinked, moving closer to the desk. "The insurance? What are you talking about? The car? The house? The Mort INS payments?" I said, pointing at the screen. $450 every month for 3 years. Did you set that up?" Mark's face went pale. Not the guilt-ridden pale of a conspirator, but the confused, washed-out pale of someone who just realized the ground beneath them is made of glass. Mom said it was a private policy, to protect the equity in case your freelance work dried up. She said it was a family rate she got through her old bank connections. She handles the paperwork, so we don't have to deal with the stress. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling, "there is no policy. That money is in a brokerage account in her name. She's been siphoning our savings for 36 months. She has $87,000 of our money, and you don't even have the password to see it." Mark shook his head, a small, jerky movement. No, that's not right. She's helping us, Elle. She's the one who told me we needed to be careful because your spending was so erratic. She said she was worried you were, She said you were skimming from the joint account for your luxury habits. I stood up, the chair flying backward and hitting the wall with a crack. She was the one skimming, Mark. She used me as a smokescreen. She told you I was the thief, so you wouldn't notice she was the one with her hand in the pocket. She's been auditing my Starbucks receipts while she was stealing $450 a month right under your nose. Mark leaned against the doorframe, his hand over his mouth. He looked like he was going to collapse. She told me it was for our future. She said you wouldn't understand the complexity of long-term planning. She said if I told you, you'd just spend it on frivolous things. And you believed her. I stepped toward him, the mirror ledger clutched in my hand. You let her into our files. You let her into our bedroom to take photos of my life. You helped her gaslight me into thinking I was losing my mind, Mark. You told me I was acting out while she was literally picking our pockets. I thought I was protecting us, he shouted, his voice cracking. She's my mother, Elena. She's an auditor. She knows how this works. I didn't think. I never thought she'd lie to me. She didn't just lie to you, Mark. She erased me. She made me the villain in our own home so she could remain the hero. And you were her most loyal soldier. I grabbed my phone and hit play on a saved voice memo I'd recorded during our last argument. His own voice filled the small room. Mom is just trying to help us find the leak. If you weren't hiding something, you wouldn't have hidden a camera. Mark flinched as if I'd struck him. He looked at the floor, his shoulders heaving. I'm sorry, he whispered. Elle, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that you handed her the keys to my dignity, I said, the coldness returning to my voice. And it doesn't fix what I found out about her past. I handed him the printouts of Martha Vance's lawsuit. I watched his eyes scan the words mismanagement of trust accounts and elderly exploitation. I watched the realization sink in that the woman he revered as the pillar of financial morality was nothing more than a high society grifter who had been caught and covered up. She's a predator, Mark, I said, and we were just her latest marks. He looked up at me, his eyes wet. What do we do? Do we call the police? Do we confront her? No, I said, a slow, dark fire lighting up in my chest. We don't call the police yet. And we don't confront her privately. She loves a private audit. She loves being the one in the room with the red pen. I looked at the daughter-in-law ledger sitting on the desk, the one Sophie had given me. I picked it up and held it over the trash can, then changed my mind. I tucked it under my arm. She wants to talk about character, Mark. She wants to talk about fiscal responsibility in front of the whole family at her birthday dinner on Saturday. Well, I'm going to give her exactly what she wants. I'm going to give her a presentation she will never forget. Elena, wait, Mark said, reaching for my arm. If you do this, if you go public, there's no coming back. For her, for us. I looked at his hand on my arm, then back into his eyes. I felt a profound sense of distance, as if I were looking at him through the wrong end of a telescope. There was no coming back the moment you took that first photo of my bank statement, Mark. You chose your side 3 years ago. I'm just choosing mine now. I walked past him, out of the guest room and into our bedroom. I didn't go to bed. I went to the closet and pulled out my suitcase. The sound of the zipper was the loudest thing in the house, a sharp, final rasp that signaled the end of our life as I knew it. I began to pack, not in a panic, but with the same methodical precision Lydia had used to track my spending. I folded my clothes, packed my equipment, and made sure I had every drive, every password, and every piece of evidence. Mark stood in the doorway, watching me. Where are you going? I'm staying at a hotel until Saturday, I said, not looking up. I can't breathe in this house anymore. It smells like her. Elle, please. Let's just talk. We can fix this. I'll get the money back. I'll tell her to back off. I stopped and looked at him. You'll tell her to back off? You still think this is a boundary issue, Mark? This is a crime. This is a betrayal of the soul. You didn't just let her see my bank account. You let her see my heart, and you let her tell you it was worthless. There is no fixing that. I headed for the front door. The cool morning air hit my face, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could take a full breath. I put my suitcase in the trunk and sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling. I looked at the house, the beautiful, structural integrity perfect house that Mark had engineered. It looked like a prison. My phone buzzed. A text from Lydia. Lydia, I haven't seen the spreadsheet yet, Elena. Thursday is the deadline for the preliminary review. I hope you're taking this seriously. Failure to comply will result in a very uncomfortable conversation at dinner. I looked at the screen and smiled. It was a cold, jagged expression. I typed back a single sentence. Oh, Lydia, I've never been more serious in my life. I'm bringing the full report to dinner. You're going to love the results. I put the phone in the cup holder and drove away. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was behind me. A pile of lies, a broken man, and a woman who thought she was the auditor. She was wrong. The audit was over. Now, it was time for the liquidation. I spent the next 3 days in a haze of work, but it wasn't for my clients. I was building a presentation. I reached out to Martha Vance's family. I spoke to the former bank employee who wrote the blog post. I compiled the Mort INS transfers into a series of infographics that were as beautiful as they were damning. I was a graphic designer, after all. If I was going to ruin a woman's life, I was going to make sure it was aesthetically perfect. By Friday night, I had a thumb drive in my pocket and a fire in my soul. I was no longer the girl who flinched at a lipstick smudge. I was the one holding the red pen. And on Saturday night, I was going to mark every single one of Lydia Miller's lies as denied. I checked into a new hotel closer to the restaurant, a place Lydia loved for its historical dignity. I laid out my dress for the next night, a sharp, charcoal gray number that matched the bag she had so accurately identified. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were dark, my face pale, but I looked powerful. One more day, Lydia, I whispered to the reflection. One more day, and we'll see who's really living beyond their means. The silence of the hotel room was peaceful. No cameras, no spies, just me and the truth. And for the first time in a long time, the balance was finally in my favor. The air inside the Gables restaurant was thick with the scent of aged oak, expensive steak, and the suffocating perfume of a dozen Millers who thought they were better than everyone else. It was Lydia's 65th birthday, and the private dining room was a sea of beige cream and quiet luxury. I stood at the entrance for a moment, smoothing the fabric of my charcoal dress, feeling the weight of the thumb drive in my clutch bag like a loaded weapon. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had settled into a slow, cold rhythm, the heartbeat of a person who has already finished the race and is just waiting for the score to be posted. Lydia was at the head of the table, draped in a silk scarf that probably cost more than my first car. She looked up as I approached, her eyes narrowing as they flicked to my handbag, the same one she'd interrogated me about weeks ago. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't even stand. She just checked her watch and said, 7:05, Elena. I suppose freelance time is different from the rest of the world's, but it's a shame to keep the birthday girl waiting. Where's my son? Mark is parking the car. Lydia, I said, my voice projecting with a clarity that made a few cousins look up from their menus. And don't worry about the time. I've spent every second of the last 48 hours making sure your gift was perfect. I think you'll find it's been worth the wait. Mark walked in a moment later, looking like a ghost in a navy blazer. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He sat down next to his sister, Sophie, who gave me a look that was half terror and half admiration. The dinner was a slow-motion car crash of polite conversation. Lydia spent the first course, a delicate lobster bisque that tasted like salt and pretension, lecturing an aunt about the moral decay of modern credit limits. People just don't understand stewardship anymore, Lydia said, her spoon clicking rhythmically against the gold-rimmed bowl. They see a balance, and they think it's a target to hit, rather than a resource to protect. Isn't that right, Elena? Did you bring the summary I asked for? I took a slow sip of ice water, the coldness numbing my throat. I brought something much better than a summary, Lydia. I brought a complete retrospective. But let's wait for the main course. I wouldn't want to spoil anyone's appetite. The tension at the table was palpable, a physical pressure that made the waiter's hands shake as he cleared the plates. When the steaks arrived, the room fell into that heavy, chewing silence that precedes a storm. Mark was staring at his plate as if he expected it to swallow him whole. Lydia, sensing my defiance, leaned in, her voice dropping to that lethal conspiratorial whisper. Elena, I know you think you're being clever, but I've seen your ledgers. I know about the art stream and the lunches. I've seen the way you bleed Mark's stability dry. If you want to make a scene here, you will only prove what I've been telling him for years, that you are a liability he can no longer afford. I smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt genuine pity for her. You're right about one thing, Lydia. This is about liability, but you've got the wrong debtor. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a deliberate, loud scrape that silenced the entire room. I walked over to the large, flat-screen monitor at the end of the room, the one the restaurant used for corporate presentations and birthday slideshows. The waiter started to move toward me, but I gave him a look that stopped him in his tracks. I plugged in the drive. Family, I said, my voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Lydia has been very concerned about fiscal responsibility lately. She's been auditing my life, my business, even my morning coffee. She thinks it's important for families to have no secrets when it comes to money, and I agree. So, as a birthday tribute to the woman who taught me the value of a deep dive, I'd like to present the Miller Family Integrity Audit. The first slide flickered onto the screen. It wasn't a picture of Lydia blowing out candles. It was a high-resolution scan of the Mort-INS transfers from my joint account with Mark. What is this? Lydia snapped, her face turning a mottled purple. Mark, sit her down. This is grotesque. Mark didn't move. He looked like he was carved out of stone. These, I said, pointing to the red-highlighted rows, are monthly transfers of $450, totaling over $16,000 in the last few years alone. Mark was told these were for insurance. But as you can see from the next slide, which is a verified statement from the brokerage firm, this money didn't go to an insurance company. It went to a private account held solely by Lydia Miller. A collective gasp rippled through the table. Sophie whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. "Elena, you are overstepping." Lydia shrieked, standing up so quickly her wine glass toppled, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like a bloodstain. "That is a family trust. I am protecting that money from your spending habits." "Protecting it," I countered, my voice rising to match her pitch. "Then why is your name the only one on the title? And more importantly, Lydia, let's talk about the seed money for your beautiful lifestyle. Let's talk about 2016. I hit the next button. The screen filled with the redacted complaint from Martha Vance. I read the highlights aloud, the words falling like hammers. Systemic siphoning of trust funds. Targeted exploitation of elderly clients. Forced resignation in lieu of criminal prosecution. Does any of this sound like stewardship to you, Lydia? The room went deathly quiet. I could hear the air conditioning humming and the sound of Lydia's heavy, ragged breathing. Her Historical dignity was stripping away, layer by layer, revealing the panicked, desperate woman underneath. You found. You have no right, she stammered, her hands grasping at the air. That was a private matter. It was settled. I was a top-tier auditor for 30 years. You were a thief for 30 years, I said, walking toward her, the space between us shrinking until I could smell the stale Earl Grey and the expensive perfume. And you thought you could do the same thing to me. You tried to gaslight me, to isolate me from my husband, to make me look like a mental patient just so you could keep your hand in our pockets. You told Mark I was the leak while you were the one holding the bucket. Lydia turned to the table, her eyes wide and manic. She's lying. She's a graphic designer. She probably photoshopped all of this. Mark, tell them. Tell them she's crazy. Mark finally stood up. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at his mother. The look in his eyes was something I'll never forget. The absolute depth of a son's devotion. I saw the login, Mom, he said, his voice trembling but clear. I saw the brokerage account. I saw the Mort INS labels. You didn't just steal our money. You made me spy on my wife. You made me hate her so I wouldn't notice I was being robbed by you. I did it for you. Lydia screamed, her voice cracking into a high, jagged wail. She was going to leave you. I knew it. I was building you a safety net because she's not one of us. She's a freelancer, a nobody with a laptop. I was protecting the Miller legacy. The Miller legacy is a fraud, Sophie said, standing up to join Mark. You've been controlling all of us with money you stole from old women and your own children. I'm done, Mom. I'm moving out tomorrow. Don't bother sending a check. The restaurant staff were hovering at the door now, frozen by the sheer scale of the drama. Lydia looked around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face, but she found only disgust and horror. Her own sisters were looking away, shielding their eyes from the wreckage. I walked back to the monitor and pulled the thumb drive out. The audit is complete, Lydia. I've already sent a digital copy of this presentation to the rest of the family who couldn't be here tonight. And I've sent a very interesting email to the ethics board at your former bank. I think they might want to take a second look at those settled claims now that there's a pattern of behavior. Lydia collapsed back into her chair, her face a mask of crumpled silk and ruined pride. She looked old. For the first time, she looked her age, and then some. You've ruined everything, she whispered. You've destroyed this family. No, I said, picking up my clutch and looking at Mark one last time. You destroyed it. I just turned the lights on so everyone could see the mess. I walked out of the private room, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind me with a final, satisfying thud. I walked through the main dining room, past the silver and the candles, and the people who were still pretending their lives were perfect. When I hit the sidewalk, the night air was cold and sweet. Mark followed me out, catching my arm under the glow of a street lamp. Elena, wait, please. I stopped and looked at him. He looked broken, a man who had lost his mother and his wife in the span of an hour. What, Mark? Where are we going? What do we do now? I pulled my arm away, gently but firmly. There is no we, Mark. You watched me drown for months because your mother told you the water was dry. You chose her audit over our marriage. Every single night, you opened that filing cabinet. You can go back in there and help her pick up the pieces of her legacy. I'm going to go live a life that doesn't require a ledger. I walked toward my car, the sound of my heels on the pavement sharp and rhythmic. I didn't look back when he called my name again. I didn't look back when I heard Lydia's muffled screams continuing from inside the building. I got into my car, locked the doors, and for the first time in years, I turned the radio up as loud as it would go. The presentation was over. The liability had been cleared. And as I drove away from the Gables, leaving the Millers and their secrets in the rearview mirror, I realized that the most valuable thing I owned wasn't in a bank account. It was the fact that, for the first time in my life, I was finally, truly unauditable. The sun felt different on my skin that first morning in the new apartment. Lighter, somehow, as if the photons didn't carry the weight of being watched. I sat on a moving box in the center of a living room that smelled of fresh white paint and citrus cleaner, holding a ceramic mug of coffee that I'd bought simply because I liked the deep teal of the glaze. No one was there to calculate the cost per sip. No one was there to ask if the teal matched a pre-approved family aesthetic. There was just the sound of a distant lawnmower and the flutter of a sheer curtain in the breeze. I picked up my phone, not out of habit or fear, but to finalize the last piece of the transition. The divorce papers had been signed 3 days ago in a sterile conference room that smelled of floor wax and regret. I remembered the way Mark looked across the mahogany table, his eyes hollow, his skin sallow, as if the departure of his mother's influence had left him physically deflated. He had tried to speak to me afterward, catching me by the elevator. He said, "Elena, I've started therapy. I'm trying to understand why I let her in like that. I want to make things right, even if it's just as friends." I had looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel the sharp sting of betrayal. I felt a profound, quiet indifference. I told him, "Mark, you can't make things right by looking at the past. You spent 3 years auditing my life. Maybe it's time you audited your own soul. I don't want to be friends. I want to be a stranger who used to know you." The elevator doors had slid shut on his stunned face, a silver barrier that felt like the final period at the end of a very long, very exhausting sentence. I scrolled through my email one last time, looking at the correspondence from the bank's ethics committee. The subject line read, "Formal update regarding inquiry #8821L." The text was dry, professional, and utterly satisfying. It said, "Dear Ms. Vance and Ms. Miller, following a secondary internal review of the 2016 trust account discrepancies, we have identified significant procedural failures. While the civil settlement remains in place, the institution is cooperating with state regulatory bodies regarding the professional conduct of the former officer in question. Lydia's historical dignity was being dismantled brick by brick. I heard through Sophie, who was now living in a cramped but vibrant co-op downtown, that Lydia had retreated into her gated community, refusing to answer the door. Her bridge club had dropped her. Her advisory roles on local boards had evaporated. She was living in a gilded cage of her own making, surrounded by the porcelain and silver that she no longer had anyone to impress with. Sophie told me on the phone. She spends all day rearranging her ledgers. "Elena, she's trying to account for where it all went wrong, but the math doesn't add up anymore." I stood up from the box and walked to the large window overlooking the park. In my hand was a small, heavy envelope. Inside was the final check from the liquidation of the brokerage account Lydia had tried to steal, after the lawyers took their cut, and the Mort Ionis funds were split. There was enough to give me a fresh start, and enough to send a significant, anonymous donation to the Martha Vance Foundation for Elderly Advocacy. I looked at the check, then at the teal mug. I realized that for 3 years, I had been living as a defendant in a trial I never signed up for. I had been justifying my existence, my career, and my joy to a woman who viewed life as a zero-sum game. But standing here, in a room that belonged only to me, I understood that the real dark secret wasn't Lydia's theft or Mark's complicity. The secret was that I was always powerful enough to leave. I just had to stop waiting for them to give me a passing grade. The buzzer for the front door rang, a sharp, cheerful sound that echoed through the empty hallway. It was the delivery of the art piece I'd bought, a massive, abstract canvas of deep indigos and gold leaf. It was expensive. It was unnecessary. It was beautiful. As the delivery men hoisted it onto the wall, the lead installer asked, "Where do you want this, ma'am?" Do you need to check with anyone on the placement? I smiled, a genuine, warm feeling that reached my eyes. I told him, no, I don't need to check with anyone. It goes right there in the center of the light, because that's where I can see it best. When they left, I sat on the floor and stared at the painting. The gold leaf caught the afternoon sun, shimmering like a promise. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new project file. I wasn't tracking expenses or looking for IP addresses. I was designing a new brand for myself, one that didn't have to fit into anyone else's ledger. My phone buzzed on the floor next to me. A text from an unknown number. I hesitated, then opened it. The message read, "You think you won, but a life without structure is just a slow bankruptcy of the spirit. One day, you'll realize that numbers are the only things that don't lie." I knew it was Lydia. I could practically smell the tea rose lipstick through the screen. I didn't get angry. I didn't type a scathing rebuttal. I simply tapped the contact, hit block, and watched the message vanish into the digital void. "The numbers don't lie, Lydia," I whispered to the quiet room. "But they also don't breathe." I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. I didn't check the time. I didn't look at my bank balance. I just reached for the teal mug, poured myself another cup of coffee, and stood on my balcony, watching the world move on below. The city was loud, chaotic, and completely unaudited. It was perfect. I was no longer Elena, the liability. I was no longer the girl with the charcoal bag. I was just a woman standing in the sun, finally debt-free in all the ways that actually mattered. The audit was over. The books were closed. And, for the first time in my life, the balance was exactly where it needed to be. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee, feeling the heat spread through my chest. I looked out at the horizon, at the endless possibilities of a life lived on my own terms. I didn't need a ledger to tell me who I was. I knew. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that no auditor could ever categorize, I realized that the best part of my story wasn't the ending. It was the fact that I was finally the one holding the pen.